Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode. Today we'll be painting Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the dashing man that threw a little boy out a window. Anyway, to start off I'll be doing the metal work like usual. So I'll just be applying a pretty thin base coat, but I've decided to go with a different metal this time. So instead of the usual kind of deeper gray, I'll be going for like a lighter tone, and that will reflect kind of the Lannister nobility and how they have, the most expensive and finest metals about, and part of their character is the fact they like it quite shiny and quite bright, and that's kind of their whole aesthetic. So it's just the major parts of the armor. He's pretty much in full plate, so just make sure you hit all those areas. Don't forget the foot, the left foot that's kind of hidden beneath the cloak. That's a little hard to get to, but just make sure you get a decent base coat on it at least. And now for this initial step, we'll just be kind of adding a nice even layer of wash. And that's just to hit all the areas, just to give us a bit of definition, and it'll help us see what we're working with. But for certain areas like the sword, some of the more complicated areas that you want to go a little more in depth on, it might be a bit better just to kind of leave it a little bare and just work on it with kind of a more careful hand. The cloak is one of the biggest parts next to the metal, so I'm just going to be adding a few layers of red, and that'll just start to kind of build up the vibrancy. So I'm just kind of going back and forth between the two just to make sure I'm not causing too big of a spill. These are pretty large areas, but you just want to be careful because you create too big of a mess, you forget about it later, and then it is a bit irksome to go back to. But don't be too worried about it if you make little mistakes. So now I'm going to just focus on getting the cloak blended up. I have a darker red, which is like a burgundy color. I have kind of a golden yellow, and then I have my scarlet color. And I'm just going to be working in between those tones, and that will get me that nice gradient. So you can see I've built it up over quite a few layers just to make sure the texture is very smooth. Then I am applying light coats of this darker and lighter color and starting to build up its strength. And then I'll return with the original color to kind of blend it all in. So it's a bit of a lengthy process, but you'll see the effect is very, very good. You could throw a wash in there, and it'll kind of tell you where the highlights and the darker areas should be, but it's best just to glaze through. So you can see the effect is semi-strong right now, but as it dries, it'll fall back in to the base tone, and so that will allow you to kind of work with it more gently until you get the type of color you're happy with. as you go along and continue this process, you just want to keep in mind that it's always a good idea to take a step back and just observe where you've placed your highlights and shadows. If you see that they're not exactly lining up properly, or that you look in a different angle and the highlight wouldn't make sense in that place, it's fine to go back with with a darker tone or that mid tone and just kind of shift it back and forth. It won't be especially difficult if you do it pretty early on or kind of midway through the process. But if you basically finish the cloak and then kind of take a few different views and say, oh, that doesn't really make sense, then it's not too late, but it's definitely a lot more annoying than trying to figure out where roughly everything should be, and then just sharpening all those locations throughout the process. So for the underside, it's going to be almost entirely this darker tone. Because of the big fold over, there's not going to be much light coming through, so it's going to be more of that mid-tone and darker tone involved. But you can see that end there where that kind of lower cloak is showing that of course will have a bit of a lighter tone. So just make sure it makes sense. The top of the cloak versus that area under the billowing cloak, it's not going to be the same tone, obviously, because you have that area under the cloak that's not going to receive the same amount of sunlight, simply because, you know, it's in a shadow. And you can try and increase the contrast over time. What's helpful about what makes this process really nice is that as you continually increase the amount of light and dark tone, you know, and you slowly shift it to almost 100% that tone, you'll start to appreciate how much better a high contrast appearance can be, especially if you haven't been trying that before. The thing about contrast is that it shouldn't be ridiculous. When it's like a subtle shift in the cloak, you're not going to have almost pitch black and almost pure white. It's going to be more of, you know, just slight differentiations in hues. But something like this crest that I'm painting right now, and the darker area that's mostly in shadow just below it, that's a really great place to really up that contrast. So you'd have that kind of orangey color almost from that golden yellow being mixed in. You could of course go with white, but that means it'll become pinkish. So also consider, when you're brightening something, what is the end result gonna be. If you don't like that pinkish color, then you might prefer mixing in that brighter yellow. If you don't like that orange, then you could go with just white and have that more pink color. So now I'm in the process of adding the brass colors. So I will be working around the shield, because that's where most of the finery is, and then I'll be adding it to the details of the main armor. I thought about, I added a little to the his shoulders, the pauldrons, but I decided I would prefer just having it mostly metal, and just kind of, you know, changing it back to more of that bright metal. So don't be afraid to just go back and switch things up. And now I'm just going across the major areas. So the elbow guards, those rounded areas, and the knees, and the sword, of course, that I'm focusing especially on with the different tones. I mixed in a little white, some white and black, in that base bright metal tone, and I'm shifting the colors so you get a nice highlight on the top and a nice dark area on the bottom, and you'll see it's a quite effective way of really adding in a lot of nice color. And the stronger you go, the better it's going to look. Of course, if you're not a fan, then you don't have to do that. But like you can see, I'm upping the brightness on the cloak again. It's always a process, especially with characters, of trying to perfect the highlights. Make sure they're all in agreement, and that you're happy with how bright certain areas are. When it comes to the sword, it was a little tricky because there were some areas where the darkness would kind of start peeping over the onto the top, and I wasn't getting the definition I wanted. So it's always okay to throw in a little wash, to add a little highlight in certain areas, to just go back and you fix your mistakes, and just kind of do that juggling act of trying to get the effect you want, trying to keep it as neat and as perfect as possible. You can see how rough that kind of highlight is near the bottom of the cloak, but it's best just to kind of work on each area. That's why it's another reason that I kind of jump around as well, is because when you highlight something, you want it to dry and then shift it back and forth after that. If you don't, then you'll start tearing up the paint and you'll get very rough texture, because you'll have the pigments, all the water around the pigments dry. But if that's incomplete, then certain areas will be dry and certain areas will still be somewhat wet. So that's what it means by tearing it up. You're going to ruin that nice even layer you put on by manipulating it when you shouldn't. So that's why you can hop around the certain areas of the cloak, and if you want to, which I don't know what kind of effect it has, you could have like a hair dryer dry the paint, but you might want to be careful, just because you could kind of deform the plastic by heating it up. But if you just give it a few quick bursts, it should accelerate the process quite a bit without actually making your sword into a noodle, or melting his face and turning into Clegane. You always want to be careful of that, just because you don't want to ruin your model. Simple as that. Now you can see I'm pretty much done with the cloak, and now I'm working on using that pure golden color now and just highlighting the edge. I thought that would be a really nice touch, just to have like kind of a trim around it. You can see I made a few mistakes, but it's pretty easy just to wipe it up afterward. And you can see that in the earlier stages, the blends were much rougher. It's very easy to see the different lines. But if you just continuously build up on those layers and keep shifting them until it's nice and smooth, it'll really be effective in terms of creating a realistic and quite smooth set of highlights and shadows. So for that little area of cloth above the right knee pad, I decided to go with like a nice dark color. I thought I kind of interpreted it as like an undercoat, so I had kind of a darker burgundy, which I kind of washed down with some black, and I add a little highlight to the center there, and I just kind of made a rough little highlight area. That it's not too large of a part of the model, so you don't have to worry about blending it perfectly. You just need to create kind of a decent transition, and it should work pretty well. At this point, I'm just base coating the face. That little kind of area around his neck, the texture seemed like kind of a sash, so I just kind of took it to be, some cloth material. So I left that. I kind of let the fleshy base coat go on it, but of course I'm just going to paint over that later. And now we're coming back to the sword. So I decided that it is sort of like a rectangular shape with four sides. So you're gonna have that darkest side opposite of the light source from above. Going to have a slightly lighter but still pretty dark side, which is like slightly raised towards the light. Then on the top side of it, it's going to be slightly darker, opposite, facing away from the head, and then brightest where you have the edge pointing closer towards the head. And so that's the general idea when it comes to painting the sword there. But of course, you can choose to do your own style. You can have that kind of diagonal light that we did on Robb Stark, if you'd prefer to do that. So right now I'm kind of reworking the armor. I'm cleaning up where all that kind of gold stuff got around, then it looked quite messy. So I took that highlight color and I just hit all those upper areas in the darker color just to bring out the shadows a little more. And then after I cleaned that up, I'm just carefully going with this kind of flesh wash and just kind of adding a little bit of color to the kind of golden brass tones across the model. And then I'll be adding that same flesh wash just to kind of add a bit of darkness to the golden hair. I want it to be quite gentle just so you can get the texture, but you don't actually have the kind of reddish color peeking out too much. It's more just to have highlights and shadows rather than, the actual reddish wash kind of showing through. Then I'm kind of creating locks by taking these highlight tones and just kind of catching those the texture of the hair, and using brighter and brighter tones until I get that kind of nice blonde look. And of course, you can see the texture gets a little muddled, so it's okay to go back and reintroduce that wash. So, as we work on the face, there's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, it's best to be very, very careful when it comes to building up these layers. You want to do it pretty subtly, but it will be a lot faster than you expect. You'll be painting quite a few layers, but in fact, it's not gonna feel like a lot less time than you think it will be. Just make sure you don't get impatient, and just kind of, you know, just work through it. So I decided to switch completely to Citadel. For the most part, when it comes to painting the face, I just found the consistency of their paints just worked really well for me, and immediately when I just started working on it, I just found it to be completely just different to what I was using before. So I'm using Kislev Flesh and just high and brightening that up with some white. I'm using Vallejo white, but I think most whites will do. And I'm just working it up in the certain areas. So the Kislev, I started on the side of the cheeks, like with the skin under the hair, and kind of worked that into the middle a little bit. And then I just took that brighter tone and kind of blended the two together, from the forehead and the chin to the side, so that kind of line down the center, to the sides there. And then I started just gradually increasing the brightness on the nose and the forehead and the chin, and that kind of main area of highlight. Pardon me. Then I just continued to bring it up to a brightness that I was happy with. Then I took that Kislev Flesh, and with a pretty thin layer, just kind of worked it into those areas of shadow. Then I added a little yellow to the highlight tone and just kind of put that on the forehead. Then I mixed in a teeny bit of red, put that on the nose and the cheeks where there's quite a bit of blood, and then actually a little bit of green, and then I put that under the chin, and that sort of area. And just to keep in mind, you want to do it in tiny amounts, where the tone shift is noticeable, but it's extremely subtle. So you'll just see it's slightly more reddish to slightly more yellow, but it's very, very hard to see. Basically, you just want it just a tiny amount on the tip of your brush. The ratio should be 1 to over 20 in terms of that tone, that little bit of color you're using to shift, versus the base highlight tone you're using. So make sure that when you're applying those colors, you're doing it very, very very gently. And if you need to add more, then you can always mix in a teeny bit more red, teeny bit more green, but make sure it's a very, very tiny amount. I don't know if I can stress that enough. Make sure it's extremely weak, but still noticeable. So now this is coming to the final stages. Um, I'm just fixing up those pieces of metal. I'm just adding what last touches I will to the face, and kind of just you know doing those final things just to make sure it looks very clean and very presentable for as a final model. And here I decided I wanted to increase the brightness even more. And I found that to work out pretty well, just building up that highlight even to an even greater degree. And here I'm just adding a little highlight to the metal bands on the leather. You could paint it like a leather color if you'd prefer, but I decided I'll just make it metal. And then of course I'm just working on certain areas that I didn't really focus on too much the first pass, and just cleaning up certain areas. I'm using this GW gold or Citadel gold, but it is a pretty light color, so just make sure you build it up in a few layers, because if you want a nice strong tone, then you have to kind of reinforce it. It's not as easy as a black or like a dark red or something like that. You have to really work on it, but don't make it very thick. It's better to have a bunch of thin layers than just get impatient and try and do it on a single thick one, because the single thick one will just look so ugly that it's just gonna ruin the effect. And it would be better if you didn't put any of that color at all, essentially. At this point, I'm just working through the process I spoke of earlier. Just adding the highlights until I'm quite happy with the face. For the lips, I find just adding a little bit of red to a semi kind of highlight tone, not the brightest highlight tone, but kind of more of a middle highlight tone. Just making sure it's not too pink, because I don't believe Jaime Lannister wears lipstick. So just make sure that it comes across as like the fleshier lip tone. You could use that kind of like a darker tone mixed with that highlight tone for the skin, like a Kislev Flesh or something like that, or Bugman's Glow, and just mix that in with the lighter tone, and you'll get kind of that fleshy color that won't appear too much like lipstick. It'll be more like the natural lip color. So here I'm just comparing the brush sizes. I decided it would be better to use the smaller size 0, when working on the eyes, because it just was far too difficult with that larger brush. And also on that red sash, I decided to do kind of a bright scarlet color around his neck. So that also took quite a fine detail. And just so you remember, the best miniature painters wear beanies. So for the eyes, I simply just did what we've been doing before. Had that white color, kind of painted a little bit of that highlight, mixed in a little highlight flesh tone, and then just carefully dotted in the eyes. I really messed up the first time around, but as you can, you'll be able to see, it just takes patience. And after cleaning up that little disaster I made, it turned out pretty dang well. So, if you mess up, don't get frustrated. Take a breather if you need to, and then just come back, paint back in that flesh tone. Don't worry about it. It'll turn out fine. You just have to be patient and just try again. If you want to see the basing and more in depth and greater depth, then you can go to my basing video in the Song of Ice and Fire playlist. Right here, though, I just threw down a few rocks, and then I'm just after painting a brown, and then I'm just kind of dabbing in some highlight colors, just mixing a little bit of beige flesh tone. Of course, this is all simply just, craft paints I'm using. And now I've spread across some PVA. I'm just putting down kind of a darker tone beneath the cape where he's standing. Then I'll be doing a little bit of highlight around that area. And then, of course, I'll be bonding the two together by throwing in some base tone. Just be careful, because there's quite a bit that you can where you can get the grass on, so make sure when you're applying the glue that you only get the base, because anything that gets wet will get grass on it. So if there's any glue on the cape, you want to make sure that you're brushing it off immediately. Of course, I've limited all that wear and tear just to the base, and very little to the cape or the boots. I wanted to keep him looking quite fresh. So I hope you enjoyed. There'll be more videos coming up, and I'll see you guys for the next one.